Hey you, yes you, the one who's already pulled the blanket up a little tighter, who turned the brightness down, who maybe told yourself just a few more minutes before sleep. I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we're going somewhere most people never expected to go. Not to a distant country, not to a mountain range or a shimmering coastline. We're going back, way, way back, to a time when the very idea of travelling somewhere far away was not a weekend plan, not a flight you booked on your phone. It was something closer to a dream, or a myth, or a fear. Here's a question that I want you to sit with for just a moment. When was the last time you went somewhere new? Maybe it was last summer. Maybe it was just last week. Maybe you've crossed an ocean. Maybe you've watched a sunset from a rooftop in a city where you didn't even speak the language. And you probably didn't think twice about how extraordinary that is. Because here's something that most of us have never been told in school. For the vast majority of human history, most people never went anywhere at all. Not because they were lazy, not because they were afraid, but because for millions of ordinary men and women across the centuries, the world simply ended at the edge of their village. And I don't mean that poetically, I mean it almost literally. During the medieval period in Europe, serfs who made up roughly 75% of the entire rural population were legally bound to the land they were born on, not metaphorically tied, legally. According to Britannica's historical record, a serf could not permanently leave his village without his lord's permission. He could not marry without permission. He could not change his job without permission. He could not even dispose of his own small piece of property without someone above him saying yes. Think about that. The land didn't belong to him, but in a very real and terrifying sense, he belonged to the land. Now, before we go any further, let me say something that might surprise you. This is not a story about tragedy. Well, not entirely. It's a story about a world that was impossibly small by our standards, and yet somehow full and strange and occasionally beautiful. A world where a person's entire universe might be a cluster of 30 or 40 families, one church, one river, and the same muddy path walked every morning for 60 years. And the question I want to explore with you tonight, the question that genuinely keeps me up at night, is this: what does it do to a person to live in a world that small? Let's paint the picture slowly. Imagine you're born in a small village somewhere in rural England. The year is somewhere around 1100. The population of your entire village is maybe 60 people. You know every single one of them. You knew them before you could walk. The furthest you have ever been from home is the weekly market in the nearest town, maybe 6 miles away. 6 miles. That walk probably took you around 2 hours. And when you arrived, it was the biggest thing in your week. The colours, the noise, the strangers passing through, the smell of animals and bread and someone else's fire. That market was your New York City. That market was your Paris. The idea that there were places beyond it, cities with 100,000 people, mountains that touched the clouds, a sea that stretched so far you could not see the other side. Those things existed the way dragons existed. You had heard of them, but you'd never seen proof. Now here is the part where it gets genuinely interesting, because historians have found something remarkable when they study the mental geography of medieval villages. Many of them had no clear understanding of what lay beyond a certain radius of their home, not because they were unintelligent, but because without any reason to go there, without any maps accessible to ordinary people, without travellers regularly passing through with news, the world beyond your village was essentially abstract. It existed in church stories, in fragments of rumour, in the occasional wandering monk or travelling merchant who passed through and left again. And those travellers, they were something. In a world where almost no one moved, the person who did move carried an almost mythological weight. A travelling merchant arriving in a small medieval village was not just a man selling cloth. He was news, he was entertainment, he was a living proof that somewhere beyond the fields, the world was doing something. People gathered around him. the way we might gather round a live broadcast from somewhere extraordinary. But here is where I want to gently push back on something. Because the image we often have of medieval common people, this idea of them as completely frozen, completely immobile, never going anywhere, is not entirely accurate. Medieval historian Lauren Johnson has pointed out that we often project our modern definition of travel, leisure tourism, backwards onto a time when that simply wasn't the framework. People did move. Soldiers marched across entire countries. Pilgrims walked hundreds of miles to holy sites. Merchants traced long routes through forests and river crossings. Young men left to apprentice in distant towns. Women moved when they married. But the key difference was this: they moved because they had to. Travel was not rest. It was not adventure. It was not something you chose for the pleasure of it. It was something that happened to you, usually because of war or hunger or God or a marriage arranged by someone else. The concept of travelling somewhere simply because you wanted to see it, simply because curiosity pulled you there, simply because the world was wide and your heart was restless. That idea barely existed, not yet. And I think that distinction matters enormously, because it means that for most ordinary people throughout history, the world was not something to be explored. It was something to be survived. You planted your crops in the same field your grandfather planted his. You prayed in the same church your mother was baptized in. You grew old looking at the same hills you'd looked at as a child. And when you died, and the average life expectancy in medieval Europe was somewhere around 30 to 40 years, though many who survived childhood live considerably longer. When you died, the footprint of your entire existence on this earth might be contained within a circle of maybe 10 miles. 10 miles, that is less than a 20-minute drive today. Now I want you to do something for me. Don't feel pity. Or at least, don't feel only pity. Because there is something else here, something quieter and harder to name. When your world is that small, every single thing inside it becomes vivid. The particular way light falls on the wheat field in early autumn. The smell of your neighbour's chimney. The sound of your village bell at noon. These things were not background noise. They were everything. They were the entire content of a life. And some historians argue, and I find this beautiful, that medieval people experienced a kind of depth of place that is almost impossible for us to understand today. They did not experience their village as a limitation. They experienced it as the world. There is a small but striking detail from medieval historical records that I have never been able to forget. Some serfs, when they were granted freedom when a lord released them from their bond to the land, legally and officially some of them did not leave. They stayed. Not because they were broken, not because they were afraid of the unknown, but because the place where they were born was the place where they understood how to be human. It was where their people were, where their rituals were, where the ground itself held memory. And leaving it, even when leaving it was finally allowed, meant becoming a stranger, meant becoming no one. I think about that sometimes when I'm sitting in an airport, watching strangers wheel their luggage past me toward a gate that will take them somewhere new in 2 hours, and I wonder what it would feel like to have never done this, to have never moved, to have been given instead one small corner of the earth, and told this is yours, all of it, enough. The world that existed before cars, before planes, before trains and highways and GPS on your wrist, it was not a smaller version of the world we have now. It was a different kind of world entirely. A world where distance was not measured in miles. It was measured in effort, in days, in danger, in the very real possibility that you might not come back. And the people who chose to cross that distance anyway, who walked and rode and sailed and stumbled their way into the unknown, they were doing something remarkable. Something we have almost entirely forgotten how to feel. But here's the thing. The story of travel before the modern age is not just the story of people staying still. It is also the story of the few extraordinary ones who moved anyway. People who walked across entire continents in leather shoes with nothing but a hand-drawn map and a prayer. People who climbed into wooden ships that smelled of rot and salt, and crossed oceans they believed might end in nothing. People who sat inside stagecoaches, rattling down rutted roads at 4 miles per hour and genuinely felt like they were flying. And right after this, we're going to walk with them. We're going to feel the road beneath their feet. Because the next part of tonight's journey takes us to the most ancient form of travel ever known to human beings, the one that required nothing but a body of road and the willingness to put one foot in front of the other and not stop. Stay with me. There is a sound that the ancient world made, and we have almost entirely forgotten it. It wasn't the roar of an engine. It wasn't the screech of brakes or the hum of tires on asphalt. It was the sound of leather soles on stone, thousands of them, moving together. A slow, rhythmic percussion that meant an empire was on the move. Picture a Roman legion on the march. Not as you've seen it in movies, all bronze helmets gleaming under a perfect sun, men striding forward with the easy confidence of gods. The reality was considerably less glamorous, and considerably more impressive. A Roman soldier on a standard campaign march typically covered somewhere around 20 Roman miles a day. That's roughly 18.5 modern miles, about 30 kilometres, every single day, and that was considered a reasonable steady pace. On what the Romans called a heavy march, they pushed to 30 miles or more. Now, before you brush that aside as just a number, I want you to feel it for a moment. 18 miles on foot in full gear every day, not once, not twice, for months at a time. The Roman military writer Vegetius documented that soldiers in training were expected to carry loads of not less than 60 Roman pounds, which converts to somewhere around 45 modern pounds, and march in formation with it. 45 pounds. That's roughly the weight of a 5-year-old child strapped to your back while you walk the length of a marathon, then walk it again, then keep going. But here is what I find endlessly fascinating about those soldiers. They weren't just moving, they were building the world as they walked through it. At its greatest reach, the Roman road network covered somewhere between 50,000 and 85,000 miles of paved highway, depending on which historical estimate you trust, stretching from the rainy edges of Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain, all the way to the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now Iraq, from the sands of North Africa to the forests of the Rhine, from the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the Danube. One connected, engineered, extraordinary web of stone, and the Romans built it not with machines, but with the same two things they used to walk it: feet and stubbornness. The engineering of a Roman road was not simple. Workers dug a trench down to solid ground first. Then they laid a foundation of large, rough stones. Then a layer of smaller rubble packed tight. Then gravel and lime. Then a final surface of flat stone blocks slightly crowned in the middle, so that rainwater ran off to either side rather than pooling on the road. They built drainage canals. They raised the roadbed above the surrounding land to prevent flooding. They placed milestones every 1,000 paces, each one a stone pillar that told travellers exactly how far they were from Rome. Imagine walking a road where every mile marker reminded you that you were part of something so vast it stretched beyond the edge of your imagination. Every stone underfoot had been placed by human hands. Every drain had been thought through by a human mind. And when you walked that road, you were walking on the concentrated engineering effort of the most organized civilization the ancient world had ever produced. Now here is the part that gets a little haunting. When the Roman Empire collapsed gradually, painfully over the course of several centuries, the roads didn't collapse with it. The roads lasted. Many of them are still there. You can walk stretches of the Appian Way today. The same stones Julius Caesar walked, the same routes Spartacus and his army might have travelled. But the civilization that maintained the roads, the inns along them, the milestones, the courier services, the bridges and the repairs, all of that fell away. And when it did, the roads became something different. They became wild paths through uncertain country. They became places where bandits waited. They became quiet reminders that once the world had been more connected than it now was. And for centuries after Rome, walking any great distance was not a feat of endurance. It was a gamble. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever walked somewhere long enough that your mind went completely quiet? Not the kind of quiet where you're bored. The other kind. The kind where your thoughts stop being words and start being something else entirely. The philosophers knew this feeling well. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the 18th century French thinker, wrote in his Confessions that he could only truly meditate when he was walking. His exact words, roughly translated, were when he stopped walking, he ceased to think. His mind, he said, worked only with his legs. Friedrich Nietzsche, a man whose ideas are complicated and often wildly misread, but whose relationship with walking was genuinely beautiful, was what his contemporaries called a fanatical walker. He kept a notebook in his pocket on every walk. He composed some of his most important work while hiking through the Swiss Alps near his cabin in the village of Sils-Maria. He believed deeply and completely that all truly great thoughts are conceived while walking. And William Wordsworth, the English Romantic poet who wrote in the early 19th century, reportedly walked somewhere between 150,000 and 180,000 miles over the course of his lifetime. He wore a literal groove into the paths around his home at Grasmere in the Lake District just from pacing the same route, over and over, turning the rhythm of his feet into the rhythm of his poems. His sister Dorothy, who walked alongside him on many of those miles, wrote about those walks with a quiet, precise tenderness that still moves me. She noticed things, the exact colour of water in a specific light, the sound a particular gait made in the wind. That kind of noticing only happens at walking speed. But I want to come back to something because I think it's important and we tend to skip over it. For the vast majority of human history, the people who walked long distances were not philosophers doing it for the joy of thinking. They were soldiers following orders, pilgrims following faith, merchants following profit, refugees following survival. And what they experienced on the road was not the meditative peace of a Sunday morning hike. It was something harder and stranger. The road before modernity was its own country. It had its own rules, its own dangers, its own strange community of people who for one reason or another were in motion, while most of the world stood still. Think about who you might encounter on a long road in medieval Europe. A monk walking alone, his lips moving in constant prayer, covering 15 or 20 miles a day between one monastery and the next. A group of pilgrims, men and women, both all ages and classes, temporarily freed from their usual hierarchies by the shared act of walking toward the same holy place, laughing, arguing, telling stories to pass the miles. Geoffrey Chaucer in the late 1400s turned exactly this scene into a masterpiece. The Canterbury Tales is not just a collection of stories, it is a portrait of what the road did to people. It made them honest. It stripped away the costumes of their social roles. Put a knight and a miller side by side for 3 days of walking and something shifts between them. A travelling merchant loaded with goods he was risking his life to bring from one city to another, moving fast, trusting no one watching every stranger's hands. A young woman travelling to her marriage in a town she'd never seen walking toward. A life that had been decided for her, the road perhaps the last space where she was still briefly her own person. And then there were the pilgrimages. Oh, the pilgrimages. This is where walking stops being transportation and becomes something else entirely, something harder to name. The Camino de Santiago, that ancient route across northern Spain to the cathedral at Santiago de Compostela, was at its medieval peak one of the most travelled routes in all of Europe. The journey from Paris to Santiago covered more than 1,000 miles, on foot, through mountains, through summer heat and winter mud, through river crossings and forest roads and the strange silence of high passes. Medieval pilgrims didn't fly to Madrid and take the last 100 kilometers. They started from their front door, wherever their front door happened to be. An English pilgrim in the 12th century would walk south from London, cross the Channel by boat, and then walk for months across France and over the Pyrenees before arriving at the cathedral. And then when they reached it, when they touched the stone of the doorway after all those hundreds of miles, they turned around and walked home, because that was the deal. The journey to the holy place was one thing. Getting yourself back was the other half. I've spent a lot of time trying to understand what those pilgrims were actually looking for. And the honest answer, I think, is that it wasn't entirely the destination. The medieval church promised that completing a pilgrimage reduced the time a soul would spend in what they called purgatory after death. That was the official reason, the theological justification. But if you read the accounts that medieval pilgrims left behind, the journals, the poetry, the letters home, what you find is something more personal than theology. You find people talking about the road itself, about the person they met at a particular inn, about a river they crossed in flood terrified, and how a stranger helped them, about waking up one morning in the mountains with the mist below them and feeling briefly like they understood something about the world that they could not put into words. The journey changed them, not because God was at the end of it, but because 2,000 miles on foot strips away everything that isn't essential. It removes the noise, it removes the performance, it leaves you with the exact shape of who you actually are. And here is where I want to offer you something that might be a little uncomfortable. We live in a world where we can cross a continent in 5 hours, where a walk of more than 3 miles feels like an event worth telling someone about, where the idea of spending a month covering ground that our ancestors would have crossed in a season strikes us as either extreme adventure or mild insanity. And I genuinely wonder, whether something has been quietly lost in that compression of distance. Not the physical hardship. I'm not romantic enough to miss blisters and banditry, but the time. The enforced, unavoidable, inescapable time of putting one foot in front of another for hour after hour with nothing to do but think and notice, and slowly, reluctantly become a little more honest with yourself. Nietzsche thought that was where great thoughts were born. Rousseau thought that was where thinking happened at all. And millions of medieval pilgrims without any philosophy to back them up simply found that the road gave them something the rest of their lives never quite managed. A kind of clarity. Here is one more thing about walking that I keep returning to. Aristotle, who built the entire architecture of Western logic, who shaped how human beings think about science and language and ethics, did not teach his students sitting in a lecture hall. He walked with them. His school in Athens was called the Lyceum, and the method of teaching there became so associated with walking that his followers were known as the Peripatetics, from the Greek word peripatein, to walk around. The philosophy came out of the motion. The ideas emerged from the road. 2,500 years later, Stanford researchers ran studies showing that even a short walk dramatically increases what they call divergent thinking, the kind of creative, flexible, associative thought that produces new ideas rather than just recirculating old ones. 2,500 years, and the science finally caught up to what Aristotle already knew on a dirt path in Athens. Walking is not just a way to get somewhere, it is a way to think, a way to feel, a way to be briefly fully present in your own body and your own mind at the same time. The world before cars and planes was a world at walking pace. And in that slower movement across the earth, human beings built roads of stone that lasted 2,000 years, wrote poetry with their feet before their hands, and crossed entire continents, driven by nothing more than faith and hunger and the strange persistent human need to see what is on the other side of the next hill. But walking, as ancient as it was never the only way, because once human beings figured out they could persuade a large animal to carry them instead, the world changed, and the road became something different entirely, muddier, faster, far more dangerous. And waiting just ahead of us tonight is the story of what it actually felt like to climb into a horse-drawn carriage and go when roads were rivers of mud, wheels were made of wood, and arriving alive at your destination was something you genuinely couldn't take for granted. Something about the stagecoach has always captured the imagination. You've seen it in old paintings, in Western films, in the kind of Christmas card that makes everyone feel nostalgic for a world they never lived in. A red and black coach gleaming in the snow, 4 horses mid-gallop, a coachman in a top hat looking impossibly dashing. It's a beautiful image, and almost nothing about it is true. Let's rewind a little. Not to the golden cinematic version of coach travel, but to the real one, the one that smelled of wet wool and horse sweat and unwashed strangers, the one where a rut in the road could swallow a wheel up to its axle, the one where arriving alive was a reasonable thing to be grateful for. The stagecoach as a form of organised public transport really began to take shape in England in the early 1600s. The name itself tells you everything you need to know about how it worked. It travelled in stages. Every 10 to 15 miles, the exhausted team of horses would be swapped out for fresh ones at a coaching inn. Then the coach moved on to the next stage, and the next, and the next. That's why the stops were called stages. That's why the vehicle was called the stagecoach. Simple enough. And in the mid-1600s, when the first regular long-distance coach service launched between London and Edinburgh, the journey took somewhere between 10 and 14 days. 10 to 14 days. London to Edinburgh. That's a trip a modern person makes by plane in about 1 hour and 10 minutes. And those 10 to 14 days assumed that the weather cooperated, that the roads were passable, that the axles didn't snap, that nobody robbed you. If any of those assumptions turned out to be wrong, and they often did, you simply sat in the mud or the rain or the roadside ditch and waited. Now I want to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been stuck in traffic on a highway and felt genuinely irrationally furious? Like the kind of fury that seems completely disproportionate to the situation I think about, that sometimes when I read descriptions of what English roads were like in the 17th and 18th centuries. One writer in 1617 described stagecoach travel as, and I'm paraphrasing here, very tedious and fit only for women and people of inferior condition, a ringing endorsement clearly. But the roads deserved the complaint. Most English roads of that period were not roads in any meaningful modern sense. They were shared dirt tracks deeply rutted with no drainage, no foundations, and essentially no maintenance. When it rained, which in England is rather often, those dirt tracks turned into something closer to a slow-moving river of mud. One historical account from the mid-18th century describes a traveller near Leeds encountering a road that was described as a narrow hollow way, little wider than a ditch, barely allowing of the passage of a vehicle drawn in a single line. A ditch, that was the road. Historical records from 1753 mention ruts near Leeds that were so deep, so entrenched from years of heavy use with zero repair, that when travellers encountered each other on that single-lane track, they sometimes chose to sit and wait, simply staring each other down rather than pull off into the mud alongside. A standoff on what was technically a public highway. And then there was the mud itself. Oh, the mud! If you have never read the first-hand accounts of stagecoach passengers dealing with genuinely catastrophic road mud, let me introduce you to a small corner of historical suffering that I find both fascinating and deeply amusing. Passengers on the inside of the coach, the ones who paid more for the privilege of being indoors, were expected to get out and walk whenever the road climbed a steep hill to spare the horses the extra weight. On rough or heavily mired sections, they were expected to get out and push. First class, second class, third class, everyone pushed. A novelist named Harriet Martineau, travelling through America in the 1830s, wrote a vivid account of exactly this experience. The coach sank into a deep rut. The horses strained and couldn't move it, and all the passengers climbed out into the cold and the dark, while the driver cut down a young tree with an axe, and used it as a lever to pry the wheel free. That was Tuesday. There is something almost comedic about it, except for the part where it was simply someone's Tuesday. An ordinary, unremarkable Tuesday on which you found yourself in a dark American countryside lifting a carriage out of the earth with a wooden lever, wondering vaguely if you were going to make it to the next town before nightfall. Let me give you a number that I think says everything. In 1750 it took roughly 2 full days to travel from Cambridge to London by stagecoach. Cambridge to London, that is about 60 miles. By 1820, just 70 years later, the same journey took under 7 hours. Same route, different roads, different coach design, completely different experience. Because by the early 1800s, the Great Turnpike era had arrived. Private companies began actually building proper roads with foundations drainage, and what engineers of the time called macadamization, a method of layering crushed stone to create a firm all-weather surface. And with better roads came faster coaches, and with faster coaches came something that travellers of previous generations would have found almost incomprehensible. By the golden age of coaching in the early 19th century, a well-run mail coach could reach speeds of around 12 miles per hour. 12 miles per hour. People genuinely found this thrilling. There are historical records of crowds gathering just to watch the mail coach. Past the way, you might stop to watch something extraordinary. The way you might pull over on a highway today to watch a thunderstorm or the northern lights or something so striking that you feel you owe it your full attention. 12 miles per hour, and people stood at the roadside and felt something close to awe. But even in the golden age, even with better roads and sprung carriages and fresh horses every 10 miles, the stagecoach remained an exercise in organised discomfort. Let me walk you inside one for a moment. The interior of a standard English stagecoach held 6 passengers, 3 facing forward, 3 facing backward, 6 adults, all their coats and bags, in a space roughly the size of a modern mid-size sedan. If it was a full coach, and it usually was, perfect strangers were pressed against each other, shoulder to shoulder, knee to knee for hours at a stretch. One American account from the 1830s describes the passengers being so tightly wedged that those facing each other were required to, quote, interlock their knees, in an age that was quite famously rigid about social propriety, about who was allowed to touch whom, and under what circumstances you could find yourself a gentlewoman perhaps, or a clergyman or a respectable merchant physically interlinked with a complete stranger's legs, because the coach simply wasn't wide enough to accommodate you both otherwise. And that was just the inside passengers, the people who had paid extra. On the roof of the coach in all weather, clinging to the railings as the vehicle lurched and swayed, were the passengers who couldn't afford inside seats. They were known with a grim cheerfulness as the hangers-on. Open to the sky, open to the rain, hanging on. Then there were the highwaymen. Here's where I have to be honest with you, the popular image of the highwayman is considerably more romantic than the reality deserves. Dick Turpin, probably the most famous name in English highwayman mythology, has been immortalised in novels and songs as a dashing, almost chivalrous outlaw, the kind of villain who bowed to ladies before relieving them of their jewellery. The reality is considerably less glamorous. What highwaymen actually did was stop coaches on isolated roads, usually at gunpoint or with the threat of violence, and take everything of value from passengers who were completely helpless to resist. The roads near London were so routinely dangerous after dark that wealthy travellers of the 17th and 18th centuries were advised to carry paste jewellery, fake gems, cheap imitations to hand over if they were stopped. You left the real pearls at home. You travelled with the decoys. That was simply considered prudent planning for a trip. There is something both dark and darkly funny about that detail. The idea that your pre-travel checklist included real jewellery stays home, fake jewellery in the bag, don't travel after sunset on isolated roads, hope for the best. Historical records also show that stagecoach robberies could be remarkably well organised. In 1822 the Ipswich mail was held up, and banknotes worth over £31,000 were taken, though most were eventually recovered. These weren't opportunistic muggings. They were coordinated operations against specific coaches on specific routes. The road had its own criminal economy. And yet, here is what I find genuinely remarkable: people kept travelling. Not just the wealthy, not just the desperate, but ordinary people, middle-class people, people who had a choice, people who understood perfectly well what they were signing up for. They bought their tickets. They squeezed themselves into the coach. They handed their bags up to the roof, and they went. Why I think the answer is more complicated than simple necessity. Yes, sometimes travel was required for trade, for family, for work. But there is something else in the historical accounts. Something you can feel underneath the complaints about the mud and the cold and the highwaymen. A kind of aliveness. The English writer Sabine Baring Gould, looking back at the old coaching days from the comfort of the late 1800s, put it in a way that has stayed with me. He described the old journeys, the discomfort, the unreliability, the risk, and then added with remarkable self-awareness, "I am now ashamed that I was not formerly more discontented." He was surprised looking back that people had put up with it without more complaint. But reading between the lines of what he wrote, the stops at bustling inns, the conversations forced by proximity, the shared relief of arriving somewhere intact, I think there was something people got from those journeys that had very little to do with getting from one place to another. They got the journey, the actual experience of moving through the world, of being in motion, of watching the landscape change mile by mile through a small dusty window. The discomfort was real, but so was something else. There is one more thing I want to tell you about the stagecoach era, and it is one of those historical details that sounds so improbable, you almost don't believe it until you sit with it. In 1784, a man named John Palmer convinced the British government to let him test a new kind of mail delivery service. Under the old system, Royal Mail was carried by a single rider on horseback. Slow, unreliable, vulnerable. Palmer's idea was to use a fast stagecoach instead. His experimental coach left Bristol at 4 in the afternoon on the 2nd of August 1784, and arrived in London just 16 hours later. The journey that had previously taken up to 38 hours was completed in 16. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, a man named William Pitt, was so impressed that he authorised the expansion of the service almost immediately. Within a year, the new mail coaches were running to more than a dozen cities. Within 2 years, they had reached Edinburgh. And the people standing along those routes watching a black and red coach thunder past at 12 miles an hour, they weren't just watching a coach. They were watching something change. Something that had been true about the world for centuries, that distance was slow, that travel was hard, that getting somewhere took what it took was starting just barely to shift. The age of speed was coming, not here yet, but coming. And while all of this was unfolding on land out on the water, an entirely different kind of journey was being made, because the stagecoach, for all its misery, at least kept you on solid ground. The people who crossed oceans in wooden ships, who spent weeks, sometimes months, on the open water with nothing but the horizon in every direction, they face something different entirely. Not mud, not highwaymen, but the sea itself. And everything that the sea, when it decides to be unkind, is capable of doing to a human being. That story is coming up next. Close your eyes for just a moment. Not to sleep, not yet. Just imagine the feeling of standing at the edge of something so vast you cannot see where it ends. No land behind you, no land ahead, nothing in any direction but water and sky and the slow, indifferent breathing of the wind in the sails. Now imagine that this is not a vacation, not a cruise, not a romantic holiday with cocktails and a sunset deck. This is your life now, for the next 6 to 12 weeks. This wooden vessel leaking a little smelling of salt and rot and too many human bodies is the entire world. The Atlantic crossing was for most of the 18th and early 19th century one of the most consequential decisions a human being could make. Not just logistically, emotionally, psychologically, because once you left the port, once the coastline faded and the familiar silhouette of land disappeared behind the horizon, there was no turning back. Not practically, not emotionally, not in any way that mattered. The world you had come from was gone. Whatever was on the other side was not yet real, and between those two states of existence you were simply suspended, floating. Let me give you some numbers first, because I think the numbers matter here. A typical westbound crossing from England to America in the mid-18th century took somewhere between 6 and 10 weeks. Under truly favourable conditions, perfect wind, no storms, healthy crew, a fast ship might manage it in around 4 to 5 weeks. Under bad conditions, 12 weeks, 14 weeks, sometimes more. One German schoolmaster and musician named Gottlieb Mittelberger made the crossing in 1750 aboard a ship called the Osgood, sailing from Rotterdam to Philadelphia with several hundred other passengers packed below deck. His voyage took 15 weeks in total from the time he left the Netherlands to when he finally set foot on solid ground. 15 weeks on a wooden ship, and what he wrote about it afterward in a book he published to warn his fellow Germans against making the same journey as one of the most vivid, unsparing first-hand accounts of ocean travel that we have from that entire century. Mittelberger described what the crossing looked and felt and smelled like, with the kind of specificity that only someone who lived it could produce. He wrote about the darkness below deck, the stench that built up over weeks from hundreds of unwashed bodies in a space barely large enough to stand in. He described the seasickness, not the polite, inconvenient kind you might feel on a choppy ferry, but the kind that lasted for days, that left people too weak to move, lying in their own misery while the ship pitched and rolled and the water sloshed across the floor of the hold. He described the food. Warm meals were served only 3 times a week. Between those meals, passengers survived on ship's biscuit, hard, dense crackers that had been baked months earlier and stored in barrels below deck. By the time they were opened, the biscuits were not simply stale. Mittelberger wrote with a precision that has haunted historians ever since, that there was scarcely a piece in the whole biscuit the size of a coin that was not riddled with red worms and spiders' nests. The water stored in wooden barrels for the crossing was frequently described as black, as thick, as smelling of something you couldn't identify and didn't want to. You drank it anyway, because there was nothing else. And the children. This is the part of Mittelberger's account I find hardest to sit with. He wrote that children between the ages of 1 and 7 rarely survived the crossing. On his own ship, not on some exceptional catastrophic voyage, just an ordinary passage in an ordinary year, he witnessed the deaths of 32 children. All of them were buried at sea. There was no earth to receive them, no grave marker, no place to return to in the years afterward and sit quietly and feel something. The ocean simply took them as it took everything else it chose to take and gave nothing back. I want to pause here because I'm aware that this is heavy, and it's meant to be. But I also don't want to leave you only with the weight of it, because the full picture of what these voyages were is not only suffering, it never was. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been somewhere so remote, so genuinely far from light pollution, far from cities, far from the hum of civilization that the night sky looked completely different? Not the grey-blue glow you're used to, not a few scattered bright stars. But the real thing, the full thing, the Milky Way as an actual river of light so dense and so vast that it makes you feel small in a way that is not frightening but strangely quietly wonderful. Most people who live in the modern world have never seen that sky. Not truly. The passengers on those 18th century ships saw it every night for weeks at a time, away from every source of artificial light with nothing but open ocean. In every direction, the night sky above a sailing vessel in mid-Atlantic was something that no photograph and no description can fully prepare you for. There are accounts from sailors of that era, not the suffering ones, but the other ones. The ones scribbled in ship logs on quiet nights that describe the phosphorescence of the water. When the ship's hull moved through the sea at night, it disturbed tiny marine organisms that emit light when agitated. The bow wave glowed. The wake left a trail of cold blue-green fire across the dark water. Sailors of the 18th century had no scientific explanation for this. They simply called it sea fire, and it appears in ship logs and journals again and again. This astonished observation of light in the darkness of something beautiful happening for no audience except the small handful of people on the ship, and God if he was watching. There is something else about those voyages that I think gets lost when we focus only on the hardship. The boredom. Not the excruciating, desperate boredom of suffering, though that existed too, but something more interesting. The peculiar enforced boredom of being on a ship with nothing to do for weeks at a time except wait. And what happens to human beings when you take away every distraction, when there is no task to complete, no appointment to keep, no noise, no urgency, just the sound of wind and water and the occasional creak of wood? Something begins to happen. People talk to each other. Not in the way we use that word now, not a quick exchange, not a conversation that ends when someone checks their phone. Real talking, hours of it. The kind that only happens when there is genuinely nothing else to do and nowhere else to be. Friendships formed in the hold of a ship over 12 weeks at sea were forged under conditions that most people today will never experience. You'd already seen each other sick. You'd already shared space in ways that stripped away all pretense. You'd already watched each other frightened and grieving and desperate. And if you survived the crossing together, if you walked off that gangplank into the port of Philadelphia or Boston or New York, you walked off with people who knew you in a way that almost no one else in your life ever would. Benjamin Franklin made 8 crossings of the Atlantic in his lifetime. 8. He was not a man who loved the sea. He was a man who needed to get somewhere and had no choice about how. But during those crossings, those weeks of suspended time between worlds, he did something remarkable. He observed. On his voyages, Franklin noticed that the westbound crossing from Europe to America consistently took longer than the eastbound return journey, not by a little, by weeks. He began asking the ship captains why. Most of them shrugged. It was simply how it was. The sea was slower going west. Franklin was not satisfied with that answer. He began gathering information from Nantucket whale captains, men who spent their working lives on the North Atlantic and knew its currents the way a farmer knows his soil. What they described to him was a river of warm water running through the ocean, flowing northward along the American coast, and then eastward across the Atlantic, a current that ships sailing west were fighting against and ships sailing east were riding home. Franklin mapped it. He named it the Gulf Stream. One of the most consequential discoveries in the history of oceanic navigation, made not in a laboratory, not with instruments, but during the long waiting hours of a sea crossing when one man refused to stop asking why. I want to come back to Mittelberger for a moment because I left him somewhere difficult and I owe him a better ending. After 15 weeks at sea, after the stench and the spoiled biscuits and the worm-filled water and the deaths and the seasickness and the storms that made the ship plunge down the face of waves, and the crew's faces go white with something they didn't name aloud, after all of that, the ship came in sight of land. And Mittelberger wrote about this moment with such unexpected tenderness that it stays with me every time I read it. He wrote that when the promontories of land appeared on the horizon, when the smudge of something solid first became visible through the haze, and the salt spray all the passengers came up from below, every single person, the sick and the half-dead, the ones who hadn't been able to stand for days, all of them somehow found the strength to climb up into the daylight and look, and they wept, not from sadness, from relief so profound it had no other way out. They prayed, they embraced each other, they sang. People who had spent weeks surrounded by death and misery, and the particular despair that sets in when you cannot see an end to your suffering. They saw a smudge of land on the horizon and they sang. Think about that for a moment. When was the last time you felt something that strongly about arriving somewhere, I mean genuinely felt it? Not just the relief of landing after a long flight, the mild irritation that delays and discomfort finally being over, but the profound soul-level gratitude of knowing you have survived something and that solid ground is real and you're about to stand on it again. I think we travel so easily now that we've almost entirely lost that feeling. The flight is delayed an hour and we sigh. The hotel room isn't what we expected and we complain. We have never had to sing because land appeared. We have never had to cry at a horizon. This sea voyage was in many ways the most extreme version of what all travel was before cars and planes. A forced suspension, a removal from everything known, a passage through discomfort and uncertainty that was also in its own strange way a passage through the self. You entered that ship as one person. You arrived on the other shore weeks or months later as someone who had been tested and had at least in part been changed by it. The physical distance covered was the same either way, 3,000 nautical miles, but the interior distance, the distance between who you were when you left and who you were when you arrived, that was something the sea gave you whether you wanted it or not. And while the sea did this to people on the open ocean, something entirely different was happening in the great inns and coaching stops along the land routes of Europe and America. Because travel, for all its hardship, had always required a place to stop, a place to eat, to sleep, to dry out, to hear news from the road ahead. And in those places, loud, strange, smoky, sometimes dangerous, always memorable, some of the most fascinating social mixing in all of history was quietly taking place. The inn at the crossroads was not just a place to rest. It was where the world came to sit down and talk to itself. That story is just ahead, somewhere between the open water and the muddy road, between the weeks of ocean crossing and the jolting misery of the stagecoach. Every traveller in the pre-modern world had to do the same thing. Stop. Not because they wanted to, because the horses needed rest, because darkness made roads genuinely dangerous, because the human body, no matter how determined its owner, eventually insists on sleep. And so scattered across the road networks of Europe and America, at the intersections of trade routes, at river crossings, at the edge of towns, there they stood. The inns, low wide buildings smelling of wood smoke and wet wool and last night's supper. Archways wide enough for a carriage to pass through. Stables at the back, light in the windows. If you were tired enough, and travellers always were, that light was the most beautiful thing in the world. Let me set aside the romanticised version of the coaching inn for a moment. You know the one, Dickensian. A crackling fire, a friendly innkeeper with rosy cheeks, warm mulled wine, a private room with a comfortable bed. That version existed, just not for most people, and not reliably. The reality for the majority of travellers throughout history was considerably more communal, and considerably more complicated. Here is a fact about pre-modern inn culture that stops most modern people cold when they first hear it. Sharing a bed with a complete stranger was entirely normal. Not just sharing a room, a bed. In rural inns across England and the American colonies, if the house was full and on busy trade routes, it usually was the innkeeper would simply put 2, 3, or sometimes more travellers into the same bed. This was not considered unusual. It was not considered rude. It was simply how things worked. Etiquette guides of the period actually addressed this. They advised that a good bedmate should lie still, refrain from hogging the blankets, and avoid snoring if at all possible. As if the snoring were the problem, one particularly memorable account from 1776 involves 2 men you may have heard of. Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, who were both delegates to the Continental Congress at the time, found themselves at a New Jersey inn with only 1 room available, 1 bed. They shared it. And according to John Adams's own account, they spent most of the night arguing about whether to leave the window open or closed. Franklin wanted fresh air. Adams was worried about the cold. These are 2 of the men who helped design the foundations of American democracy lying in a bed together in New Jersey, bickering about a window. I love history so much. The inn, for all its discomforts, was something more than a place to sleep. In a world without reliable postal systems, without newspapers in every town, without any of the mechanisms we now use to know what is happening in the world, the inn was where news arrived. Every traveller who came through the door brought something with them. The state of the roads ahead, the prices in the last market town, a rumour about a political shift, a story about a flood or a fire or a battle 3 counties away. The innkeeper who saw dozens of travellers a week when most villagers saw dozens in a year was often the most informed person in any given community. And the common room of the inn where merchants sat next to farmers, where a lord's courier might eat beside a travelling pedlar, where a clergyman and a soldier shared a table because there was no other table available. That room was one of the few spaces in the rigidly hierarchical world of pre-modern Europe and America where the normal rules of who speaks to whom were temporarily suspended. Not erased, not forgotten, but suspended. The road did that. It levelled people. Not all the way, not permanently, but enough to make conversation possible between people who would never have spoken otherwise. Samuel Pepys, the 17th century English diarist who is still one of the best windows we have into everyday life in that era, visited taverns constantly. His diary mentions them by name, dozens of them scattered across London and the roads leading out of it. He drank there, he did business there, he heard gossip there. He wrote in his diary there, scribbling entries in his private shorthand code at a corner table while the room buzzed around him. Pepys understood intuitively what the inn was. It was not just a lodging, it was the nervous system of the city. The place where information flowed, where deals were struck, where a man might learn something important about his rival, or hear news that would change the direction of his week. He visited so many taverns so often that scholars have catalogued them. Dozens of named establishments appear across nearly 10 years of diary entries, each one a fixed point in his social and professional landscape. The tavern for Pepys was where the world happened. Across the Atlantic in the American colonies, the inn and the tavern were playing an even more interesting role. By 1750, the city of Philadelphia alone had more than 120 licensed taverns and inns. 120. For a city of around 30 to 40,000 people, That is roughly one licensed drinking and lodging establishment for every 250 to 300 residents. The Museum of the American Revolution historian Tyler Putman put it, plainly the tavern was simultaneously the restaurant, the bar, the meeting house, the place to read newspapers, the place to hear gossip, and the place where total strangers sat down together because there was no other choice. And in that forced proximity, something remarkable happened. People talked about things that mattered. Consider what the Green Dragon Tavern in Boston was doing in the 1770s. It was a perfectly ordinary public house. Low ceilings, wooden floors, the smell of ale and tallow candles. But it was also quietly the meeting place of the Sons of Liberty. Samuel Adams came there regularly, John Hancock, the men who would in a few years be among the architects of a revolution. Daniel Webster, the 19th century statesman, would later call the Green Dragon the headquarters of the revolution. And just across town in Philadelphia, a tavern called the City Tavern, which John Adams himself described as the most genteel tavern in America, served as the informal gathering place for the delegates to the Continental Congress. Jefferson met Adams there. Franklin joined them. After the formal sessions ended after the arguments and the votes and the procedural debates, the founders of the United States walked down the street, sat down with their legs under a tavern table and kept talking. The Constitution, in some meaningful sense, was hammered out over a leg of mutton and a glass of Madeira in a room full of strangers and travelling merchants and local tradesmen who had no idea what the men at the corner table were discussing. The United States Marine Corps traces its formal founding to a single tavern in Philadelphia, the Tun Tavern, where on the 10th of November 1775 the first two battalions were recruited from among the ordinary drinkers who happened to be there that day. Imagine that. You walk into a bar for a drink, you walk out a Marine. Now here is the thing I find genuinely fascinating about all of this. The tavern worked as a social leveller not because people intended it to be one, but because travel itself forced it. When you're cold and tired and your coach has just spent an hour in a ditch, you do not particularly care whether the man sitting beside you at the fire is a duke or a dock worker. You care that he is not a thief and that he will pass the bread. The road stripped away the luxury of choosiness, and in that stripping away it created something that was in its own rough and accidental way genuinely democratic. A historian at the Aeon Academic Journal described it this way: the tavern was where ordinary colonists could voice their opinions and hear different perspectives, where the democratic ideals that would define America were not just debated in formal halls of government, but lived in the everyday interactions around its tables. I think that's exactly right, and I think there is something melancholy about the fact that we have lost that particular accidental democracy. The places where strangers are forced to sit together now are not usually the places where anyone talks about things that matter. We have our noise-cancelling headphones. We have our screens. We have our very efficient systems for making sure we never have to look a stranger in the eye for longer than strictly necessary. But I want to tell you about one more thing the inn gave travellers because I think it is the most quietly important of all: news. In a world without electronic communication of any kind, information moved at the speed of the fastest horse, which meant that news of what was happening in the next county, let alone the next country, arrived at the inn in the pocket of whoever had ridden from there, and in the common room where the literate and the illiterate sat side by side, because literacy was not yet universal, and many people in the 18th century could not read something extraordinary happened regularly. Someone who could read would pick up the newspaper that had been left on the table by a traveller from the city, and they would read it aloud to everyone in the room: the merchant who had ridden in from London, the farmer who had walked from the next village, the young woman travelling with her family to a new home, the old soldier making his slow way along a familiar road, all of them gathered around a fire listening to someone read the news of the world. not silently alone, each in their own bubble, together, out loud. With argument and commentary, and the occasional shout from someone who strongly disagreed with the king's latest decision, there is something about that image that I've thought about many times. The idea of news as a shared communal spoken thing, not a broadcast, not a scroll, not an algorithm feeding each person a slightly different version of events. One voice reading one account and a room full of people reacting to the same words at the same time. I'm not saying the old way was better. The tavern was also loud and rough and full of tobacco smoke, and occasionally the scene of something unpleasant. But there is something that room had that our current arrangements have quietly lost. The unavoidable presence of the other person. The fact that you could not opt out, could not mute them, could not algorithmically remove them from your experience. They were there, with their different opinion and their different background and their different smell, and you had to reckon with them. The inn at the crossroads was where the road forced people to become briefly temporarily human to each other. It is where Samuel Pepys heard gossip that shaped his understanding of power. It's where Benjamin Franklin and John Adams argued about a window, in the small, comic, deeply human way that reminds us that even extraordinary people are just people cold and tired and wanting the same things as everyone else. It is where the men who drafted the Declaration of Independence sat down after their official deliberations and kept talking informally honestly, with the kind of candour that empty hours and shared meals make possible. And it is where ordinary people, farmers, peddlers, soldiers, pilgrims, runaways, merchants sat together, not because they chose each other, but because the road had chosen them, and they were all for one night at least in the same place at the same time. What happened at those tables mattered. The ideas that were spoken aloud there, the news that passed from mouth to mouth, the arguments that kindled around those fires, they shaped things. They shaped elections and revolts and migrations and the slow grinding movement of ordinary public opinion towards something new. The revolution was not only fought on battlefields, it was cooked up, as historians have put it, in the ordinary rooms of ordinary inns, where strangers ate and argued and went to sleep 3 to a bed. And those strangers, the ones who travelled for wealth or war or faith or freedom, some of them were not ordinary people at all. Some of them were the young sons of aristocratic families sent deliberately by their parents into the wide world to be educated by it, not in a schoolroom, not from a book, but on the road, in the cities of France and Italy and the ancient ruins of Greece, the grand tour. That story is waiting just ahead. Imagine your parents sat you down one morning and told you this. For the next 2 to 3 years you will travel through France and Italy. You will see the great cities. You will study the art in the ancient ruins. You will learn languages, meet foreign royalty, and come home a different person. Then they handed you a letter of credit worth several £1,000s and pointed you toward the door for a specific class of young men in 18th century England. This was not a fantasy. It was Tuesday morning. The Grand Tour. The name sounds almost satirical now, like something a travel company invented to sell overpriced packages to people who wear linen blazers. But from roughly the 1660s to the 1840s, nearly 2 centuries, the Grand Tour was one of the most consequential institutions in the Western world. Not a vacation, not a holiday, a rite of passage. An educational tradition so embedded in English aristocratic culture that a young man who had not made the tour was considered in certain circles as not quite finished, not quite polished, a little rough around the edges like a portrait that hadn't been varnished. The term itself was coined in 1670 by a clergyman and travel writer named Richard Lascelles in his guidebook The Voyage of Italy. He used it to describe a journey that was already well established by then, the practice of sending well-born young men south and east across Europe to be educated not by books alone but by experience. By the 18th century the standard route had solidified. You crossed the English Channel from Dover to Calais, which was already an adventure in itself given that channel crossings in small wooden boats were at the mercy of whatever the weather decided to do that day. Then Paris. Paris was always Paris, the city where you spent months learning to dance, to fence, to speak French fluently enough to pass in polite society, and to navigate a world of manners and fashion more elaborate and unforgiving than anything back home. Then south through Lyon, through the Alps, and down into the extraordinary, disorienting, beautiful chaos of Italy. Venice, Florence, Rome, Naples, and for the more adventurous or the wealthier, perhaps Sicily or even Greece. The whole circuit done properly took 2 to 3 years. Some tours stretched to 4 or even 5. A 3-year grand tour in the 18th century could cost somewhere around £5,000, which, to give you a sense of scale, was roughly 5 times the annual income of a skilled professional of that era. Not a budget trip. Now here is where it gets interesting. The parents who sent their sons on this tour had a very clear idea of what they expected to get back. A polished gentleman, a man who had seen the great art of the Renaissance with his own eyes, who had stood in the Roman Forum and felt the weight of civilization, who spoke French and Italian, who could hold his own in diplomatic conversation, who had returned with paintings and sculptures and refined taste, to fill the family estate with proof of his worldliness. What they actually got back was frequently something more complicated. Some young men came home exactly as intended, transformed, educated, genuinely shaped by what they had seen. Edward Gibbon, the English historian who would go on to write one of the most ambitious works in the English language, made his grand tour in 1763. He was 26 years old. On the 15th of October 1764, he sat alone among the ruins of the Capitol in Rome as the last light faded from the sky. Below him, in what had once been the Temple of Jupiter, a group of barefoot friars were chanting vespers. Their voices rose through the broken columns, through the silence of 1700 years of accumulated ruin. And something happened to Edward Gibbon in that moment. He later wrote about it in his memoirs, called it his Capitoline vision, the moment when the idea of writing the history of Rome's decline and fall first entered his mind. Whether the story is precisely accurate, historians debate the details. The broader truth is undeniable. The Grand Tour put Gibbon in a ruined city at dusk. The ruins put something in Gibbon, and what came out of that encounter eventually across 6 volumes published over 12 years was one of the defining works of Western historical writing. It is still in print today. That is what travel did to the right person. It didn't just show them something, it changed the direction of a life. Then there was the painter Joshua Reynolds, born in 1723. Not wealthy, not aristocratic, but determined enough to find a patron who would allow him to spend 3 years in Italy studying art. He arrived in Rome in 1750. He spent 2.5 years moving between the great studios and galleries, absorbing everything he could, ruining his hearing in one ear from spending too much time in cold churches, but filling himself up with centuries of technique and vision that he would spend the rest of his life slowly releasing back into the world. When Reynolds returned to England, he founded the Royal Academy of Arts in London in 1768. He became its first president. The institution still exists, still trains artists, still stands in London as one of the great artistic bodies in the country. A young man from Devon went to Italy on someone else's money. A national institution came home with him, but I promised you the complicated version, so let me give it to you. Not every young man on the Grand Tour came home with a vision or an artistic institution. Lord Chesterfield, who wrote famous letters of advice to his son while the young man was on tour, spent years trying to remind the boy that the purpose of the journey was education, not dissolution. He wrote with barely concealed anxiety about the dangers waiting for a young man let loose in Venice and Naples and Rome, With a generous allowance, no parents nearby, and the social skills of someone who'd been told all his life that his wishes were important. Those dangers were real. Some young men gambled away substantial parts of the family fortune at continental gaming tables. Some formed what the period delicately called mésalliances, romantic entanglements with people considered unsuitable. Some returned with what historians simply record as venereal disease, and a somewhat different set of priorities than when they had left. The tutors who accompanied them called bear leaders by contemporaries a nickname that tells you everything about the experience wrote home with increasing desperation about charges who had discovered that being young and wealthy and far from home was in itself a form of intoxication. And you can almost sympathize. Can you imagine 21 years old, Venice in summer, money in your pocket, no one who knew your family for 500 miles in any direction? The real miracle is that any of them came home at all. But here is what I find most genuinely interesting about the Grand Tour, not the art, not the scandals, but the social phenomenon underneath both of them. The tour created for the first time in European history something resembling a shared international culture among the educated classes. Young men from England and Holland and the German states converged on the same cities, the same ruins, the same studios. They met each other. They argued about art and politics and philosophy, in French because that was the shared language of the educated elite. They read the same guidebooks. They commissioned paintings from the same artists. They sent letters home describing the same moments of awe. The painter Canaletto built much of his career on commissions from British grand tourists. In 1731, Lord John Russell, who had become the 4th Duke of Bedford, commissioned Canaletto to paint 24 views of Venice following his own visit to the city. 24 paintings, to remember a place, to carry Venice home on canvas because you had no other way to carry it. Historians later calculated that Lord Russell paid at least £188 for that set of paintings, more than 5 times the annual earnings of a skilled craftsman at the time. But here is the thing I want you to sit with. He paid that much because there were no photographs. There was no Instagram. There was no way to pull out a phone and capture the moment. The only way to keep Venice was to pay a master painter to create it for you. And so the grand tourist came home with crates full of marble statues from Rome, paintings rolled up carefully from Venice and Florence, sketches and prints and fragments of ancient stone. They filled their country houses with proof that they had been there, that the world beyond England was real, and they had stood inside it. And in doing so, they changed those country houses, changed English taste, changed English architecture and art and interior design, in ways that are still visible today in the long colonnaded galleries and the Italian-inflected gardens of houses built in the late 18th century by men who had stood in Rome and come home wanting to build what they had seen. There is a detail about the Grand Tour that tends to get lost in the more glamorous stories about art and education and transformation. The women who were left behind. The Grand Tour was with rare exceptions a male institution. The daughters of the same aristocratic families were not sent to Italy for several years of self-discovery. They stayed home. They were educated differently, not to develop the kind of broad, expansive worldview the tour was designed to produce, but to be suitable wives for the men who had returned from it. Mary Wollstonecraft, the 18th century writer and philosopher, who is widely considered one of the founders of feminist thought, wrote about this asymmetry with clear-eyed fury. She observed that the very education designed to produce a cultured worldly English gentleman was simultaneously denied to the women who would share his life. He came home with Canaletto on the walls and Cicero on his lips. She'd been preparing herself to receive him. That inequality is part of the story too. It does not diminish the genuine intellectual and cultural legacy of the tour. but it is part of the honest accounting of what the tour was. The Grand Tour ended eventually, not because people stopped wanting to travel, but because travel itself changed. The French Revolution in the 1780s and 90s closed the continent. Napoleon made it actively dangerous. And when peace finally came back to Europe after 1815, the world that travellers returned to was already different. The railways were coming. Thomas Cook was coming. The idea of ordinary people moving through the world, not just aristocrats with letters of credit and bear leaders, but merchants, shopkeepers, school teachers, was beginning to take shape. And with that democratization of travel came something the Grand Tour had never quite achieved. The idea that seeing the world was not a privilege for the few, but a possibility for the many. That the transformation the tour promised that encounter with something larger than yourself. That moment of standing in a ruined city at dusk and feeling time move differently might belong to everyone. And in that gap, in that strange hinge between the world of the aristocratic tour and the world of mass travel that would follow, there is a question that has stayed with me. Is travel still doing what it used to do? Is it still capable of producing that Gibbonian moment, that bolt of inspiration arriving in the silent ruins of something ancient? Or have we learned to move through the world in such a way that we see everything and are changed by almost nothing? I don't know the answer to that, I genuinely don't, but the question itself feels important. And just as the Grand Tour was fading into history, something else was quietly becoming one of the most politically charged acts a person could perform. Not the journey itself, but the document you needed to make it. Because it turns out that for most of human history, the idea that you had the right to cross a border freely, that moving from one place to another was simply something a person could do, was not a given. Not at all. For women especially. For the poor. For the enslaved. For anyone outside the narrow definition of those whose movement was considered acceptable. Travel was never neutral. It was never just about distance. It was always in some way about power. That story is just ahead. Pull out your passport for a moment if you have one nearby, or just think about it. That small burgundy or blue book in a drawer somewhere. The one you'd grabbed half-panicked the night before a flight. The one with a photo that somehow makes you look vaguely suspicious despite the fact that you are trying your very hardest to look normal. That document represents something most of us have never had to think twice about. The assumption that you are allowed to leave. That your movement through the world is yours to decide. That a government document exists to smooth your path, not to control it. That assumption, as it turns out, is astonishingly new, and for most of human history. For most kinds of people it was not true at all. Here is something that tends to genuinely surprise people when they first hear it. Before the First World War, before 1914, passports were largely not required to travel within Europe. Not required. You could board a train in London, cross the Channel, move through France, into Switzerland, into Italy, without anyone formally demanding to know who you were or where you were going. The expansion of railways across Europe in the mid-19th century had made international travel so common and the sheer volume of passengers so enormous that enforcing any kind of document requirement had simply become impractical. So governments largely stopped trying. For a few extraordinary decades before 1914, a person with enough money could move across much of the Western world with almost no official interference. The historian Zachary Shaw has described this period as the last era of genuinely open borders in the modern West. And then in the summer of 1914 it ended almost overnight. Within weeks of the First World War beginning, virtually every government in Europe introduced mandatory passport requirements for security reasons, to control the movement of potential spies, to track men of military age, to prevent the wrong people from going the wrong places at the wrong time. What had been a temporary wartime measure gradually, almost reluctantly, became permanent. By 1920, the League of Nations had convened a conference to standardize the format of the new passport, a small booklet with pages for stamps that would look, broadly speaking, much like the one sitting in your drawer today. One summer changed how every human being on Earth would relate to the act of crossing a border for the next 100 years and beyond. But the passport story, the story of who is allowed to move and who is not, goes much further back than 1914. And it reaches into territory that is far more uncomfortable than a brief wartime inconvenience. Let me tell you about a document called Free Papers. In the antebellum United States, in the decades before the Civil War, there were approximately 400,000 free black Americans, men and women who were legally free, who'd been born free or manumitted or who had purchased their freedom. 400,000 people who were legally not enslaved in a nation where roughly 2.5 million other black Americans were. For a free black person to move in that world, to travel between states, to cross certain county lines, even sometimes to walk down a particular road, they were required to carry documents. Papers that proved their legal status, that certified to anyone who stopped them that they were who they said they were. Free papers, a piece of paper upon which your entire claim to autonomous existence depended. Think about what that means in practice. You wake up in the morning a free person. You have legal standing. You have rights, at least technically. And then you step out your front door, and the entirety of your freedom can be challenged at any moment by any white person who decides to question it. Your freedom is not assumed. It has to be proven, on demand, in the street, and the papers could be stolen. In 1841, a free black man named Solomon Northup left his home in New York to take up what he believed was a short musical engagement in Washington. He left without his free papers. He should have been gone a few weeks. He was drugged, kidnapped, stripped of his identity, given a new name, and sold into slavery in Louisiana. He spent 12 years there before he was finally freed. 12 years. His freedom, legally real, genuinely his, was destroyed by the absence of a piece of paper, not by any change in law, not by any failure of his own. But because in that world a document was not just a document, it was the physical proof of your humanity, and without it, your humanity could be denied by anyone with the power to do so. I think about Solomon Northup every time I watch someone breeze through passport control barely glancing up from their phone. The assumption underneath that breezing that the document is a formality, a mild inconvenience, nothing more, is a luxury built on the fact that no one in that line has ever had to fight for the right to hold one. The story of women and travel documents is a quieter injustice, but it is no less striking. In the United States, in the early 20th century, a married woman could not receive her own passport. Not her own passport with her own name. She was listed on her husband's passport as and wife. Literally. Mr. John Doe and wife. No first name, no surname, no individual identity of any kind. Just an annotation on her husband's document. As the historian Craig Robertson, author of The Passport in America, put it plainly, a married woman's public identity was tied to her husband, and passports reflected that in being issued to the husband, with his wife being a literal notation, not a person, a notation. If a married woman wanted to travel independently, wanted to cross an international border without her husband present, she could apply for a separate passport. But it would still arrive in his name, Mrs. John Doe, defined not by who she was, but by whose wife she was. This was not changed until 1937, when a memo, not even a law, just a memo from the State Department's Passport Division, quietly eliminated the wife of requirement. 1937, 87 years ago. The right to exist as a named individual on your own travel document was not something women in America had until living memory, And there is another layer to this, because when the First World War created the modern passport system, it was not designed with everyone equally in mind. In the early years of the passport era through the 1920s, only adult males could in most situations receive a passport in the first place. Family members, specifically wives and children, were simply written into the husband's and father's passport if they happened to be travelling with him. The passport was not a document for individuals, it was a document for men, with wives as footnotes and children as inventory. But here is what I find genuinely moving in the middle of all this restriction and exclusion. Some women did not wait for the rules to change. Bessie Coleman was born in Atlanta, Georgia in 1892. She wanted to fly, not figuratively, literally. She wanted to be a pilot. But no American flight school would accept her, not because of any formal barrier specifically against Bessie Coleman, but because every flight school in the country had an informal consensus that certain people did not belong in cockpits. So Bessie Coleman saved her money, learned French, got a passport, and in 1920 crossed the Atlantic to attend aviation school in France. She became the first Black American woman to earn an international pilot's license. The first, in 1921. She did not get a seat at the American table, so she got on a boat, crossed an ocean, earned her credentials in a country willing to give them, and came home with something that could not be revoked, a document of competence. If the system wouldn't give her freedom of movement, she made her own. There is a painful irony worth naming here. The period before the First World War, those few open border decades when European citizens could move freely without passports or formal documentation, that freedom applied most easily to wealthy white men. The grand tourist, the gentleman traveller, the commercial merchant. For women, even in that era of relative openness, social constraints limited movement in ways no border official needed to enforce. For Black Americans, moving through the antebellum South with freedom papers was never the uncomplicated thing it was for others. For the poor, the document was irrelevant anyway because the money required to actually travel was never there. The freedom to move has always been unevenly distributed. The passport didn't create that inequality. It just made it visible. Here is a question that has stayed with me while researching all of this. When we think about travel in the pre-modern world, we tend to imagine it as simply difficult, slow, uncomfortable, dangerous in the physical sense. But the deeper difficulty, the one that gets less attention, was this. For most people throughout history, the question was not, how do I get there? The question was, am I allowed? The serf who needed his lord's permission to leave the manor, the wife listed as a notation on her husband's document. The free black man who checked his pocket for papers before stepping outside his front door. The woman who crossed an ocean not because she wanted adventure, but because the adventure she deserved had been refused to her at home. The freedom to travel was never simply a matter of roads and ships and coaches. It was always underneath all of that a matter of who was considered a full person, whose movement the world was organized to facilitate, and whose movement required permission. What changed slowly and incompletely, and still not entirely, was not just the infrastructure of travel. It was the moral framework underneath it, the gradual, contested, still unfinished expansion of the idea that movement is not a privilege to be granted by someone with power over you, but a right that belongs to you simply by virtue of being human. The passport in your drawer is the descendant of documents that were used to restrict and control human movement, as much as to enable it. It is worth remembering that, every time you hand it across a counter, every time the officer stamps it without looking up, someone fought for the right you are exercising so casually, and yet this is the thing that keeps pulling at me even in the world of papers and permissions and restrictions. Even with all of that weight and injustice people kept packing, They kept preparing. They kept making lists and gathering supplies and imagining what they would need and how they would carry it. Because the journey, whatever its cost, had always mattered enough to attempt. The question of what travellers packed, what they chose to bring, what they were advised to take, what they feared they might need, that is a story all its own. And it tells you something very specific about how people thought about risk and distance, and the possibility that the world on the other side of the journey might ask something of you that you hadn't quite anticipated. That story is up next. Before every great journey in history, there was a quiet private moment that almost nobody writes about. The night before, departure, not the journey itself, not the arrival, not the grand encounter with the unknown, but the night before, when someone sat in the dim light of a candle and looked at everything they owned and had to decide, what do I bring? What will I need? What of everything I have is worth carrying across the miles that are coming? That question reveals something. It always has. We tend to romanticize the pre-modern traveller. Bold, unencumbered. Just a cloak and a pair of good boots and an unbreakable will. The reality was something considerably more anxious, considerably more methodical, and depending on who packed the medicine chest, considerably more pharmacologically interesting than you might expect. In 1820, a British writer named Mariana Stark published what many historians consider the first modern travel guidebook, a book called Travels on the Continent, written specifically for ordinary British tourists now venturing into a Napoleon-free Europe for the first time in years. It is a remarkable document. Stark was meticulous, practical, unsentimental. She invented the star rating system for tourist attractions using exclamation marks instead of stars, a system so useful that her publisher John Murray adopted it, and which eventually influenced the star ratings that every travel guide uses today. She was also incidentally shared a publisher with Jane Austen. The same house that printed Emma also printed Stark's guidebooks. I find that detail wonderfully strange, but it is her packing list that I want to talk about, because her packing list tells you everything about what travel actually meant to people in that era. Stark recommended that a sensible traveller never leave England without the following items: a room lock to secure yourself inside whatever accommodation you found, your own tablecloth and napkins because you could not trust the inns, a silver teapot because of course. And then there was the medicine chest. The medicine chest was not optional. It was in Stark's view as essential as the shoes on your feet, and what went inside it tells you a great deal about the relationship between travel and risk in that period. She recommended bark, which was powdered cinchona bark used to treat fever, sal volatile smelling salts for fainting, sulfuric acid, which in small quantities was added to water that smelled suspicious on the theory that it would render the water safe to drink, ipecacuanha, an emetic for poisoning, and here it is, pure opium on the packing list, between the ipecacuanha and the essential oil of lavender. For what purpose? Pain relief, sedation, the management of severe illness far from home. A different world, clearly, but also a world in which people understood before they even departed that something might go very wrong on the road, and that you were responsible for your own survival in a way that no modern traveller ever truly has to be. There is something I find genuinely moving in the logic of that medicine chest. Every item in it represents a specific fear: the sulfuric acid for the bad water, the opium for the pain that might arrive without warning, the emetic for the food that might not be what it claimed, the room lock for the strangers in the inn, the smelling salts for the moment when the body simply gave out from exhaustion or shock, or the accumulated weight of being. Far from home in a world where no one knew your name, packing for the pre-modern traveller was an act of imagining every possible disaster and trying to bring its remedy. It was risk management in the form of a leather trunk, And those trunks themselves. Oh, the trunks. Before rolling suitcases and overhead bins, a person of means travelling in the 18th or early 19th century did not pack light. They packed comprehensively. The grand tourist of the 1700s travelled with multiple servants, several trunks of clothing, and sometimes, for the longer journeys, furniture. Actual furniture. Because you could not trust that the places you would stay would have chairs you were willing to sit in. A guidebook from the period advises bringing your own bedding for the same reason. Practical advice given what we know about the inns. But this means that preparing for a journey for someone with the resources to do it properly was not a matter of hours, it was a matter of weeks. The logistics of what to bring, how to transport it, how to protect it, how to get it across the Alps without breaking it, or losing it to river crossings or highwaymen. These were genuine problems that occupied real time and real energy before the first step of the journey was ever taken. For those without resources, the calculation was different. The immigrant sailing from Ireland or Germany to America in the mid-1800s was often advised by emigration guidebooks to bring specific quantities of provisions, flour, salt, pork, dried peas, because the shipping company's rations could not be trusted. And even then, the weight allowance per passenger was ruthlessly enforced. You could not bring everything. You had to choose. What do you keep? What do you leave behind? Not a philosophical question, a practical one with real consequences. Many people arriving in the New World arrived with nothing but what they could carry in their arms and what they could hold in their memory. The furniture stayed. The neighbours stayed. The churchyard where their parents were buried stayed. They brought their skills, their language, their recipes from memory and whatever fit in a single trunk that was probably searched, shaken and half ruined by the crossing. There is a custom that has largely disappeared from modern travel, but was extraordinarily common throughout the medieval and early modern periods. Before a long journey, many travellers would write or update their will, not as a formality, as a genuine acknowledgement that the road ahead was uncertain and that they might not be coming back. Medieval pilgrims setting out for Jerusalem often distributed gifts to friends and family before departure, not after death, but beforehand. The way people now might leave instructions for their affairs if they were heading into surgery, because the mortality rate on long journeys was real. Storms at sea, bandits on the road, fever picked up from contaminated water in a foreign country, a broken axle, the wrong ford crossed at the wrong hour. Death did not announce itself. It simply appeared somewhere between here and there and took whoever it found. So you wrote your will, you made your peace, you prayed if that was the kind of person you were, and then you packed your trunk and walked out the door and tried not to look back too long. Let me ask you something, and I genuinely mean it. When was the last time you prepared for a journey as if it might change you? Not just the logistics, not just the packing list, but the actual internal preparation, the quiet reckoning with what you were leaving, what you might find, who you might be when you returned. Most of us now step onto a plane with the same mental energy we bring to a commute. It's just distance managed and compressed and made routine, and there is something genuinely gained in that compression. Efficiency, comfort, time saved. But there is also something quietly lost. The traveller of the 18th century who packed a medicine chest with bark and sulphuric acid and pure opium and a silver teapot was doing something more than preparing for physical contingencies. They were entering into a relationship with risk. They were acknowledging through every item they chose to include that the world was genuinely uncertain, that their body was genuinely vulnerable, that the journey would ask something of them they could not fully predict in advance. And I think that acknowledgement, that honest, unsentimental reckoning with the unknown, did something to those travellers that our own carefully managed risk-minimised journeys very rarely do to us. It made them present. It made them serious. It made the act of departure a genuinely weighted thing. Robert Louis Stevenson, the Scottish writer who gave us Treasure Island and The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, walked through the mountains of southern France in 1878 with a donkey named Modestine and wrote a book about it. His packing list for that 12-day walk included a sleeping bag. He designed himself a revolver for safety, a spirit lamp for cooking legs of mutton and eggs and cold sausage and chocolate for food, and a copy of a book of poetry. Not because 12 days in the French mountains was genuinely dangerous in 1878, but because walking through any landscape for 12 days with a stubborn donkey named Modestine requires preparation for the full range of what the experience might deliver. Stevenson described the act of packing as its own form of thinking. You cannot pack for a journey without making decisions about who you are and what you value, and what you can live without. The list is never purely practical. It is always in some way a self-portrait, and then there is a detail from the pre-modern world of travel that I keep returning to because it tells you so much about the emotional architecture of departure in a way that nothing else quite captures. Letters of introduction. Before the world had a connected infrastructure, before hotels had booking systems, before consulates were everywhere, before a stranger in a foreign city could simply navigate to the nearest chain restaurant and eat a familiar meal alone with their phone for company, a traveller in the 17th or 18th century arrived in a new city carrying letters. Handwritten letters signed by people back home, addressed to other people in the destination city saying, essentially, this person is who they say they are. They are known to us. Please receive them. Not a credit card, not a passport photo, just a letter from someone who vouched for you. Your entire social existence in that new city where you stayed, who received you, whether you ate well or badly, whether you were someone or no one at all, depended on those letters. On the quality of your connections back home, on whether the people who knew you were also known to people in Paris or Rome or Philadelphia. The social capital of pre-modern travel was entirely embodied in those small pieces of paper. And what strikes me, every time I think about letters of introduction, is how different they made the act of arrival. You did not arrive as an anonymous individual. You arrived trailing your relationships behind you, the friends who trusted you, the teachers who had known you, the family whose name carried weight in certain rooms. You were never quite alone on the road because the road was always connected to the web of human relationships that had made your journey possible. Today, packing takes most people a few hours. We consult lists on our phones. We debate whether to bring an extra charger. We weigh our bag at home to avoid the airport fee, which is fine, efficient, sensible. But somewhere in the compression of all that preparation, all the uncertainty and the medicine chests and the letters of introduction and the wills and the prayers and the silver teapots, somewhere in the collapsing of all that weight into a carry-on bag and a boarding pass, something changed in how we relate to the act of leaving. The journey became a service, the destination became the point, and the preparation became a transaction rather than a ritual. I'm not sure that is entirely a loss. I'm not sure it's entirely neutral either. What we do know is that when travellers of earlier centuries arrived somewhere new, having packed for every contingency, having prepared for the worst, having carried their medicine and their vouching letters, and their own room lock across roads and rivers and mountain passes, the act of arriving was charged with meaning. The destination was not just a place, it was an achievement, a reward for everything the preparation had cost them, and what it felt like to see that place for the first time with no preview, no photographs, no expectation management. That story is just ahead. Here is a question that I think about more than is probably healthy. What does it feel like to see something truly magnificent when you have absolutely no idea what to expect? Not the carefully managed version of expectation that we all carry now. Not the 15 photos you've already seen on a friend's feed. Not the video someone posted from the exact angle you'll also stand at when you get there, but genuine, unmediated, total surprise. The gasp before the knowing. When was the last time you had that? For most of the travellers we've been following through this long night, every great destination arrived without preview. There were no photographs, no film, no quick search that would have shown you exactly what the Colosseum looked like, or how the canals of Venice smelled on a summer morning, or how small you would feel standing in the nave of St. Peter's Basilica for the first time. You had descriptions, letters from people who had been there before you, maybe a print, an engraving, a rough sketch in a guidebook that gave you some impression of a place's shape. But the place itself, its scale, its colours, its particular quality of light, the specific weight of the air, the sound of it, that was completely unknown until you were standing inside it. And something about that not knowing produced experiences so intense that people wrote about them for the rest of their lives. In the year 1817, a French novelist travelling through Italy walked into the Basilica of Santa Croce in Florence. His name was Marie-Henri Beyle, though he wrote under the pseudonym Stendhal. He had been building toward Florence for weeks. The road there, the exhaustion, the Alpine crossing, the slow descent into Tuscany, where the light itself seemed to change into something thicker and more golden than anything he had known in France. And then, inside Santa Croce, surrounded by the tombs of Michelangelo and Machiavelli and Galileo, three of the men who had most shaped the world he lived in, something broke open in him. He wrote about it afterward with startling honesty, that he was seized by a kind of ecstasy, that his heart began to pound with a violence he had not expected, that his legs weakened beneath him, that he walked out of the church in genuine fear of falling to the ground. He described what he felt as being close to heaven, a tide of emotion so deep it was almost indistinguishable from religious awe. For a long time, people read Stendhal's account with a kind of polite skepticism. Surely he was exaggerating. Surely this was literary flourish. But then, more than a century later, an Italian psychiatrist named Graziella Magherini began to notice something unusual in her work at the hospital of Santa Maria Nuova in Florence. She was seeing tourists, not patients who had been injured or fallen ill in the ordinary way, but perfectly healthy people brought in by their companions, who had experienced palpitations and dizziness and profound disorientation not from altitude or heat or bad food, but from standing in front of art. By the time she formally documented the phenomenon in 1979, she had recorded more than 100 such cases. She named the condition Stendhal syndrome after the man who'd first described it, and she observed that the common thread was always the same: a visitor encountering the beauty of Florence, without adequate psychological preparation for how much it would demand of them. More than a century of travellers cycling through the same shattering experience, overwhelmed by beauty, they had travelled weeks to reach beauty that arrived with no buffer, no preview, no gradual introduction. Just the thing itself suddenly present more than they had imagined. I want to sit with that for a moment, because I think it tells us something important about what travel at its most intense actually does to a human being. When you approach something slowly, when you have walked toward it for days, when you have anticipated it through weeks of preparation, when you have no photographs to pre-absorb it, you arrive as a completely open vessel. Your capacity for astonishment has not been pre-spent. You have not already had the experience second-hand, and so when the thing appears, it has the full force of reality behind it. It lands like something real, because it is something real, and you have not yet learned to cushion that reality with representation. The grand tourists of the 18th century understood this at least instinctively. They wrote about Rome the way people now write about experiences that changed the direction of their lives. One traveller's account from the period describes arriving in Rome and having no words for the storm of emotions that followed. He described wandering through the streets on his first Sunday, deliberately trying to surprise himself by turning a corner and suddenly encountering the Column of Trajan, the Pantheon, the Pyramid of Caius Cestius, buildings he had studied in books for years, buildings he knew the dimensions of, buildings whose historical significance he could have lectured about, and finding that knowing about them in the abstract bore absolutely no relationship to standing beside them in the flesh. The knowledge was correct. The experience was something else entirely. Samuel Johnson, the great 18th century writer and critic, once observed that a man who has not been in Italy is always conscious of an inferiority. He did not mean that the man was actually inferior. He meant that there was something Italy gave you, something that the city of Rome handed to a visitor simply by existing, by being as old and layered and dense with human meaning as it was that no book could substitute for. You had to stand in it. You had to let its scale reach your body. You had to feel the specific quality of being small in front of something that had outlasted every single human being who had ever contributed to building it. And that experience, that feeling of sublime smallness, produced something in people that they describe with consistent bewilderment throughout the centuries of travel writing we have. They could not quite explain it. They just knew they had been changed by it. But arrival was not only about the great monuments, it was also about the small unexpected things, the things nobody had warned you about, the specific flavour of the water in a Venetian well, the sound a Florentine market made at dawn, the way the fog came off the Thames on a winter morning and made the whole city look like something half-dreamed. These were the details that travellers carried home more faithfully than any painting or engraving could carry them. The specific sensory texture of a place, its smell, its noise, its particular quality of stillness at 3 a.m, that texture could only be captured in person, and it could only be captured for the first time once. There is something I've been thinking about for a while now, and I want to share it with you because I suspect some of you have felt it too. We have built an extraordinarily efficient system for managing the surprise out of travel. You can see virtually any destination before you set foot there. You can see it in summer and winter. You can see it from the exact viewpoint that will give the best photograph. You can read reviews of specific rooms in specific hotels, and know before you arrive whether the bathroom has good light. This is in many ways wonderful. It reduces the risk of expensive disappointment. It makes travel accessible in ways that benefit enormous numbers of people. It means you don't arrive in a city after 12 hours of travel to find that the restaurant you plan to visit is closed on Tuesdays. I genuinely appreciate all of that. But somewhere in all of this management of expectations, something has also quietly been lost. The capacity to be stopped cold by beauty that you are not prepared for. The experience of a place landing on you with the full weight of its own reality, rather than the softened landing that familiarity provides. Stendhal had palpitations. He walked with the fear of falling. And in my darker, more honest moments, I wonder if we have traded that particular exposure to the unmanaged real for the comfortable certainty that what we find at our destination will match the photographs we've already preloaded into our minds, which is almost certainly will, which means we will arrive already adjusted, already accustomed, already in some small way already past the moment of arrival. The strange thing is we've not entirely lost the capacity for it. Art historians report that people still faint in the Uffizi Gallery, still have to sit down suddenly, still find tears on their faces that they cannot quite account for standing in front of a painting they have seen reproduced 1,000 times, but somehow never understood until they were in the same room with it. The Stendhal syndrome still happens, in lesser forms, still happening, which suggests that the body's capacity for genuine overwhelm is not entirely dead. It is just rarer. It requires more from the encounter, because we are more defended against it. Here is something that I find genuinely beautiful. For the pre-modern traveller, the moment of arrival was rarely just about the destination. It was about everything the journey had cost, every muddy road, every sleepless night in a strange bed, every moment of wondering whether you had made a terrible mistake. All of that weight arrived with you. And when the thing you had been travelling toward finally appeared, whether it was the towers of a cathedral emerging from morning mist, or the smudge of a coastline after weeks at sea, or the Forum of Rome finally visible through the window of your carriage, you felt it not just with your eyes but with your entire exhausted, grateful, astonished body. The journey had calibrated you for that moment. It had made you ready to feel it fully. And I think that is the insight that keeps surfacing throughout everything we've been exploring in this long night. The journey, the actual physical, difficult, uncertain journey, was not the price you paid to reach the destination. It was part of the experience itself. Part of what made arrival into arrival rather than simply changing location. The 2 weeks at sea, the weeks in a jolting coach, the nights in bad inns, the wrong roads and the cold mornings. All of it was preparation. Not preparation for comfort, but preparation for feeling. And now we're beginning to approach what might be the most philosophical corner of this whole journey. Because if the physical difficulty of travel was what made arrival so meaningful, what happens when we remove all the difficulty, when the plane lifts off the ground and puts the distance beneath you so quickly that you have no time to become someone who has travelled far? What do we arrive as the pilgrimage route came first? And in some ways it put the whole question of why people travel at all most clearly on the table. The road to Canterbury, the road to Jerusalem, the road to Santiago. Not just a journey toward a place, but a journey towards something the traveller was trying to become. That is the story we reach next one of the oldest, strangest, most enduring forms of travel that human beings have ever practiced. Stay with me. Of all the journeys we've been moving through tonight, this one sits in a category of its own. Not travel for commerce, not travel for education, not travel because a war was happening somewhere and you happened to be standing in its path. Pilgrimage. The strangest, the most ancient, the most persistently human form of travel that has ever existed. The deliberate choice to walk towards something sacred not because your body needed to get somewhere, but because your soul did. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something that I find genuinely interesting to sit with. What is the most meaningful journey you've ever made? Not the most comfortable, not the most scenic, not the one with the best Instagram photos. The most meaningful. For most people, when they think about it honestly, the answer involves some form of difficulty. Something hard. Something that cost them something. A journey where the destination mattered. Not despite the effort it required, but because of it. That is the psychological architecture of pilgrimage. And it is not a medieval invention. It is a feature of the human mind that is as old as the mind itself. Let me tell you what pilgrimage actually was in practical terms for the people who undertook it in the medieval period. It was expensive. For ordinary people, the ones who are not wealthy merchants or aristocrats, a pilgrimage to a major shrine represented a financial commitment that could take years to save for. It was dangerous. The roads were not policed. Bandits were a real and documented threat. Wild animals in some regions were a genuine concern. Disease was a constant companion on any long journey, and medical knowledge was limited enough that falling ill far from home was frequently a death sentence. and it was long. A pilgrimage from England to Jerusalem in the 14th century did not take 2 weeks. It could take a year. The journey there, the time spent in the holy places, and the journey home if you made it home. Many pilgrims did not. And here is the part that I find almost impossible to fully absorb. They knew that before they left. They wrote their wills. They settled their debts. They said goodbye to their children as if they might never see them again. Because they might not. And then they went anyway. So the question that has occupied theologians and historians and psychologists for centuries is simple enough. Why? What was worth that? The official answer, the one the church offered, was indulgences, the formal reduction of time spent in purgatory after death, which could be earned through acts of penance, including the great pilgrimages. Go to Jerusalem, go to Rome during a Jubilee year, walk to Santiago de Compostela, and the accounting of your soul's debt would be adjusted in your favour. For people who genuinely believed in the mechanics of sin and punishment, and the afterlife that awaited them, and in the medieval world nearly everyone did, this was not a metaphor. It was a transaction, a spiritual economy. You paid in miles and suffering, and God credited your account. But I do not think that is the whole story. Because when you read the actual accounts that medieval pilgrims left behind, the diaries, the letters, the devotional texts, what you find is something considerably more complicated and considerably more human than a simple theological transaction. You find people describing the road itself as the point, not the destination. The road. The German mystic Felix Fabry, a Dominican friar who made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem twice in the 1480s, wrote one of the most detailed and honest accounts of medieval travel that we have from that era. He wrote about the misery of the sea crossing, the heat, the food, the boredom, the smell of too many people in a confined space for too long. He also wrote about the extraordinary psychological effect of being entirely outside your normal life, away from your routine, away from your social role and your obligations and the particular shape that your daily existence had carved you into. On the road for weeks or months at a time, none of that existed. You were simply a person moving, and something about that simplicity that enforced reduction to the bare facts of the body and the road and the horizon did something to people, something that the ordinary life at home never quite managed. Marjorie Kempe was not a mystic in the conventional sense. She was a merchant's daughter from King's Lynn in England, now known as King's Lynn, born around 1373. She married a man named John Kempe, had 14 children, ran 2 businesses that both failed, and then in the early 1400s experienced a series of religious visions so intense that she began to weep uncontrollably at religious services. Not quiet tears, loud, violent, uncontrollable sobbing. She became notorious for it. Other pilgrims on the roads of Europe would try to lose her in crowds or simply walk away from her because her weeping was too much to bear. In 1413, at the age of 40, she made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, travelling alone for significant stretches, which was essentially unheard of for a woman of her time. When she reached the site of the crucifixion, when she finally stood in the place where, according to everything she believed, the most consequential event in human history had occurred, she fell down. She spread her arms, she screamed, not out of grief, out of something she could not name, something that combined religious awe and love and sorrow and joy into a single overwhelming sensation that her body expressed the only way it could. Her fellow pilgrims were, to put it gently, not entirely supportive. One of them later wrote that Kempe's weeping was a great trouble to them, which is a very English way of saying she was a lot. But Marjorie Kempe went on to make 3 more pilgrimages. She travelled to Rome, to Assisi, to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, She continued weeping publicly at every significant sight, and she wrote about it all in what became the first autobiography written in the English language. Not the first travel book, the first autobiography. A woman who barely anyone had heard of for centuries was recording in meticulous emotional detail the interior experience of medieval pilgrimage, the fear, the exhaustion, the moments of transcendence in a form that had never quite been attempted before. What did pilgrimage make? This is the question I keep coming back to, because pilgrimage did not only do things to the people who undertook it did things to the world. The pilgrimage routes of medieval Europe were in a very literal sense the first organized travel infrastructure in the Western world. Think about it. Before anyone was building roads for commerce, before there was a tourist industry, before the concepts of hotels and restaurants and guide services existed, the pilgrimage routes had all of these things, because pilgrims needed them. Monasteries and hospices were established along the major routes specifically to provide shelter and food and care for pilgrims. Bridges were built across rivers to draw pilgrim traffic through certain towns which then profited from it. Roads were maintained and improved. Guidebooks were written, the 12th century Codex Calixtinus, one of the earliest examples of a printed travel guide, was written specifically for pilgrims heading to Santiago de Compostela, complete with route descriptions, accommodation recommendations and useful information about local customs and potential dangers. The modern travel industry, the hotels, the guides, the infrastructure of getting strangers safely from one place to another, its genealogy runs directly back through the pilgrimage routes. God built the tourism industry, accidentally. Pope Boniface VIII declared 1800 of the first Jubilee year a year in which pilgrims who travelled to Rome and visited the major basilicas would receive a full indulgence for all their sins. Historians estimate that somewhere between 200,000 and 2 million people made the pilgrimage to Rome in that single year alone. 2 million people on foot and on horseback converging on a single city that was unprepared for their arrival. Giovanni Villani, the Florentine historian who was there and witnessed it, wrote that the city of Rome was so overwhelmed with pilgrims that many had to sleep in the fields outside the walls because there was simply no room. That one year 1800 is sometimes cited as a founding moment of mass tourism, not because anyone intended to create tourism, but because the pilgrimage had become so organized, so infrastructurally supported, and so deeply embedded in the medieval imagination that it generated movement on a scale the modern world would not see again for another 500 years. There is one aspect of pilgrimage that I think gets lost in the historical accounts, lost in the theology and the economics and the infrastructure, and it is the most important one. Pilgrimage gave people permission to leave. In a world structured around obligation to your Lord, to your family, to your parish, to the particular piece of land where your life was supposed to happen, a pilgrimage was one of the few socially sanctioned reasons to walk away from all of it. Not forever, not in defiance, but in search of something. Marjorie Kemp left 14 children. She left a husband. She left the failed businesses and the small social world of King's Lynn, and the road opened up. For months at a time she was no one's wife and no one's mother. She was just a woman walking. She was a pilgrim. And that word pilgrim was its own kind of identity, a recognized category of person whose needs the world had organized itself to accommodate, who had the right to food and shelter at the monasteries along the route, who had the right to be in motion in a world that otherwise insisted you stay still. I think about that a great deal, the permission to leave. We talk a lot now about burnout, about the need to detach and decompress, about the psychological value of getting away from your ordinary life. We have resorts for this, retreats, wellness programs, apps that help you practice being present in places you have paid a significant amount of money to be temporarily present in. Medieval Europe had something rawer and stranger, and probably more effective. It had the road. It had the permission embedded in theology to walk away from everything for a while in search of something that mattered. And the difficulty of the road, the hardship that made every pilgrim a different person at their destination than the one who had left, was not a problem to be solved. It was the medicine. There is a medieval proverb recorded in Spain that went something like this: "Leave as a pilgrim, return as a prostitute," which is a very blunt warning about the moral dangers of leaving your community behind. The breakdown of routine, the exposure to strangers, the loosening of the social structures that kept behavior in check. But embedded in that warning is also an acknowledgement that pilgrimage changed people. Not always in the ways the church intended, sometimes in more complicated ways, sometimes in ways the pilgrim did not expect and could not entirely account for when they arrived home as someone slightly different from the person who had departed. The road always changes you, whether or not that change is what you are seeking, and we are nearly at the end of the long night of travel that we've been walking through together. 9 ways of moving through the world before cars and planes. 9 different textures of what it meant to go somewhere before going somewhere became routine. There is one thing left, not a method of travel, not a historical fact, but a reckoning. A question about what all of this meant, what was gained in the speed, and what, if anything, was quietly lost when the world compressed itself into flight paths and motorways, and the particular frictionless ease of arriving somewhere new without the journey having asked very much of you. That conversation is up next, and I think it might be the most important one of the night. On the 5th of July 1841, a former cabinet maker and Baptist preacher named Thomas Cook had an idea thus changed the world. He was walking 15 miles from his home to Leicester to attend a temperance meeting, the kind of walk that in 1841 was simply what you did to get somewhere when a thought arrived. He later described it as a flash through the brain. What if the newly invented power of the railways could be used to move ordinary working people not toward commerce or war or necessity, but simply toward experience? What if a labourer from Leicester could arrive somewhere new, not after days of muddy roads and exhausted horses, but in a single morning for the price of a shilling? On that day in July, Thomas Cook organised a train from Leicester to Loughborough. 485 people boarded. The fare included return traveller meal and the services of a brass band that accompanied them. It was, historians would later agree, the world's first package tour. Now I want to be clear about something. The democratization of travel that Thomas Cook began is one of the genuinely great stories of the modern era. Before Cook, travel of any real distance was the preserve of the wealthy. The grand tourist with his letter of credit, the merchant with his commercial purpose, the pilgrim with their faith, which was in its own way a kind of currency. After Cook, the world began to move differently. By 1851, Cook had arranged transport for 165,000 people to visit the Great Exhibition in London, the first World's Fair housed in the extraordinary Crystal Palace that Hyde Park could barely contain. By 1866, he was organising tours to the United States. By the 1870s, tours to Egypt. By the 1880s, around-the-world journeys. The idea that ordinary human beings had the right to see the world. Not just the privileged few, but all of them took root in Thomas Cook's brass band train trip, and has been growing ever since. That is a good story, an important story, a story worth celebrating. And yet, alongside the great democratic opening of travel came something else, something smaller, harder to name, more ambiguous, a quiet loss. John Ruskin was born in 1819, 22 years before Thomas Cook's historic train trip. He was an art critic, a writer, a philosopher of enormous influence in Victorian England. A man who had spent his childhood being taken by his parents on slow carriage tours through France and Italy, stopping at every town, drawing every architectural detail, sitting with paintings for hours rather than minutes. Ruskin understood beauty the way very few people understand anything, not as decoration, as a form of truth. And when the railways came, when the iron tracks began cutting through the valleys he loved, through the landscapes he had spent his life learning to see, he was furious. Not at the engineering, not at the technology, but at what the speed was doing to the relationship between human beings and the world they moved through. He wrote about a beautiful valley in Derbyshire, a place called Monsall Dale, a landscape of limestone gorges and clear rivers that had taken 10,000 years of geology to compose, and then a railway company blasted through it. Ruskin wrote with a kind of grief that reads as entirely contemporary, "The valley is gone." And then he said something that I find genuinely devastating in its precision. Now every fool in Buxton can be at Bakewell in half an hour, and every fool in Bakewell at Buxton. Let me sit with that for a moment. Because Ruskin is not saying that working people should not travel. He is not saying that Derbyshire belongs only to the educated classes. He is saying something more subtle and more disturbing. He is saying that when you move through something at railway speed, when the valley becomes a backdrop, a blur, a few seconds of window view rather than a landscape you inhabit, at the pace of a walking body, you do not actually experience it. You pass through it, which is a very different thing. The valley still exists technically, but the relationship between the traveller and the valley has been fundamentally altered. You're no longer in it, you are through it, and Ruskin could not accept that this was progress. Here is a question for you. Have you ever travelled somewhere and in the process of getting there found that the journey itself was part of what you remembered, not the destination? The getting there, the 4-hour drive through countryside you'd never seen, the overnight train where you woke up to a different landscape out the window, the boat trip where the destination appeared slowly on the horizon after hours of open water. There is a specific quality of attention that slow travel produces, not the grinding, miserable attention of physical suffering, not the pilgrim's blistered feet, or the stagecoach passenger's bruised spine, but the simple attention of a body that has been in motion long enough to have settled into the rhythm of moving. That quality of attention is difficult to manufacture at speed. When you arrive at a destination after 6 hours of driving, you have driven through a great deal. You've had 6 hours of moving through the world. When you arrive after 6 hours of flying, you have been in a pressurized tube at 35,000 feet above the earth, watching a small screen eating a meal that no one would describe with the word nourishment. One of these arrivals puts you somewhere, the other teleports you. The railways did not only change the speed of travel, they changed the psychology of it. Doctors of the 1840s and 50s noticed something unusual among their patients. People were arriving from train journeys in states of profound nervous agitation that had no clear physical cause. Physicians named the condition railway neurosis, not from accidents, not from injury, but from the sheer speed itself, from the disorienting experience of moving through landscape, faster than the human brain had ever been asked to process it. Before the railway, the fastest a person ever travelled was roughly the speed of a galloping horse, perhaps 30 miles per hour, and only briefly. The early railways moved at speeds of 30 to 50 miles per hour for extended periods. For the first passengers, this was genuinely physiologically shocking. Trees blurred. The horizon moved strangely. The relationship between your body and the ground beneath you was suddenly incomprehensibly different from anything your nervous system had evolved to handle. Some people described feeling that the world had become unreal, that they had somehow left their own bodies behind, that something essential about the experience of being somewhere had been taken from them by the speed. These are extraordinary descriptions from people who are simply riding a train, and they knew something, those early passengers, something they could feel but not quite articulate about what was being exchanged in the bargain with speed. Travel writing changed completely when the railways arrived. Before the railway travel writers wrote about the road, the quality of the light at a specific hour, the conversation at a coaching inn, the unexpected beauty of an unremarkable village seen from horseback at dusk. They wrote about the texture of moving through the world. After the railway travel writing became increasingly about destinations, about arrival, about what to see and how long to spend seeing it. The journey itself, the space between one place and another, started to disappear from the literature of travel, because you could not really write about it anymore. There was nothing to write. You had simply been carried forward while the world scrolled past a window. I want to be genuinely honest with you here because I have been sitting with this tension throughout this entire night of storytelling, and I do not want to resolve it falsely. The romanticization of slow travel has its own problems. The coach journey that lasted 12 days in the mud was not an enriching encounter with landscape. It was exhausting, dangerous, and frequently miserable. The pilgrimage to Jerusalem was not a spiritual wellness retreat. It was a journey that many people did not survive. Difficulty for its own sake is not a virtue. Suffering is not depth. And the democratization of travel the world, in which a factory worker's child can see Venice, can stand in Rome, can watch the sun rise over the Grand Canyon, that world is better than the one it replaced. Full stop. But I keep returning to something Ruskin said not in his famous rage about the railway in Derbyshire, but in a quieter moment. He argued that to truly possess the beauty of something, to actually own it, in the deepest sense to carry it in yourself, as something that had changed you, you had to pay attention to it in a way that took time, not passive observation, sustained, patient, engaged attention, the kind of attention that requires your body to slow down to the speed of the thing itself. A tree examined in passing is just a shape. A tree drawn from observation for an hour is something you will carry for the rest of your life. Ruskin taught drawing to ordinary working people, not because he wanted them to become artists, but because he believed that the act of drawing forced the kind of attention that made beauty real, not decorative, but actual, not a background, a presence. And I genuinely wonder whether that is what speed has gradually taken from us. Not the ability to get somewhere, not the beauty of the destinations, but the attentiveness, the slow, patient, engaged relationship between a moving human body and the world it moves through. When a medieval pilgrim walked to Jerusalem, when they spent months on the road, sleeping in monasteries, eating strange food, getting lost, helping strangers, and being helped, they arrived with Jerusalem already inside them in some way that a flight into Ben Gurion Airport cannot quite replicate. The journey had been a kind of preparation, a long, slow act of opening. Thomas Cook's brass band train trip cost 1 shilling, 11 miles, one morning, and from that tiny, cheerful, well-intentioned seed grew the entire modern tourism industry, the airports and the budget airlines and the booking platforms and the all-inclusive resorts and the 14-hour connecting flights and the 48-hour city breaks, and the hundreds of millions of people moving through the world every year in ways that would have been absolutely incomprehensible to anyone who walked to Loughborough. It is extraordinary. It is a triumph of human ingenuity and democratic possibility. And something has also been lost in it. Something small and difficult to name. Something that lived in the gap between departure and arrival in the days or weeks or months that used to exist between here and there. Something that the speed has quietly compressed to nearly nothing. We are at the end of the long journey, not the journey through history with one more chapter of that ahead of us, but the journey through everything travel required of people before the world made it easy, through the villages that were entire worlds, through the roads of empire, through the mud and the highwaymen, through the sea crossings where 32 children never arrived, through the inns where revolutions were plotted, through the mountains where young men packed their medicine chests and their silver teapots and left wondering if they'd come back. All of it was in service of something, of the specific irreplaceable experience of being somewhere new as someone who had worked to get there. There is one more thing I want to talk about tonight. Not about what was lost, but about what might be found again. The slow world is not entirely gone. The Camino is still walked. The long road still exists. The choice to go slowly to let the journey be the point, not just the destination, is still available to anyone who wants it. Not because it is necessary, not because the aircraft and the motorway are wrong, but because sometimes the richest travel is the kind that asks the most from you, and the lessons that old world of difficult journeys offers us now, not as a prescription, but as a mirror. Those are what we'll sit with in the very last passage of tonight. Stay with me. We are almost there. We've arrived, not at a destination, at the end of a very long road that we've been walking together through the whole of tonight. And before we say good night, before you close your eyes and let this long drift of history carry you gently into sleep, I want to give you one last thing, not a fact, not a date, something quieter than that. Let me tell you about a man who spent 24 years walking. His name was Ibn Battuta. He was born in Tangier, Morocco in 1304. At the age of 21, he set out on what he intended as a simple pilgrimage to Mecca. He never really came home. Over the next 29 years, he travelled approximately 75,000 miles through North Africa, the Middle East, Persia, India, the Maldives, the coasts of East Africa, the steppe lands of Central Asia, and possibly China, not in a plane, not in a car, on foot, on horseback, by boat, sleeping in caravanserais and royal courts and strangers' houses, learning languages as he went, changing as he went. He eventually dictated his account of those travels to a scholar named Ibn Juzai, a book known as the Rihla, meaning the journey, and it became one of the most important documents of 14th century global life that we have. Not because Ibn Battuta was trying to write history, but because he was trying to understand the world he had moved through. All that walking all those years had produced not just a record of places visited, but a genuinely transformed human being. A man who knew in his body what it felt like to be a stranger in 40 different countries, who'd been lost, welcomed, endangered, and saved in 100 different languages over nearly 3 decades. When he finally came home to Morocco, those who met him noted something different in his eyes. The road had made him into someone that staying home could never have produced. And Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant who travelled to China in the 13th century, not by booking a flight to Beijing, but by setting out from Venice and walking east for 3.5 years before he arrived at the court of Kublai Khan. He spent 17 years in China and the surrounding lands. When he returned to Venice, people did not believe his stories. The wealth he described, the scale of the cities, the sophistication of a civilization that made much of medieval Europe look frankly modest. His accounts were so astonishing that readers dismissed them as fantasy. The book was nicknamed Il Milione, the Million, a slightly mocking reference to the million marvels that Polo claimed to have witnessed. But history, patient as always, came around. Archaeological records and cross-referenced accounts confirmed most of what Polo described. He had simply been somewhere, so far beyond the experience of the people listening to him that the truth itself sounded impossible. That is what real travel does in the end. It takes you somewhere so different from where you started that you come home carrying a new category of understanding, one that your neighbours who have not left cannot easily receive. There is a Chinese Buddhist monk named Xuanzang. You may have heard of him, though perhaps by his story rather than his name, who travelled from China to India in the 7th century to collect Buddhist scriptures that had not yet been translated into Chinese. The journey there and back took 17 years. He crossed the Gobi Desert on foot. He traversed the Himalayan mountains. He covered roughly 16,000 miles largely walking, through territories where he was as often in danger as he was welcome. He came home with 657 Buddhist texts carried on horseback texts he then spent the rest of his life translating. His journey became the source material for one of the great novels of Chinese literature, Journey to the West, a fantastical retelling of Xuanzang's pilgrimage that has influenced Chinese culture for 1,000 years. One man, one very long walk, 17 years. A literary and religious legacy that is still alive and still shaping things 14 centuries later. I keep coming back to these travellers, Ibn Battuta, Marco Polo, Xuanzang, not because their journeys were typical. They were extraordinary by any measure, but because they illuminate something about the relationship between distance travelled slowly and the depth of what that distance teaches. None of them arrived knowing what they would find. None of them had read reviews. None of them had preloaded their destination through 100 photographs, until the real thing was merely a confirmation of what they had already seen on a screen. They went into genuine darkness, and the darkness gave them something that we in our brilliantly illuminated, impeccably documented, algorithmically curated world of travel find genuinely difficult to replicate. So let me ask you quietly before you sleep, what would it mean for you to take one journey the slow way? Not to abandon the modern world, not to pretend that planes and trains and highways are wrong, but to choose once to let the distance between here and there be something you feel in your body rather than something you simply cancel out. To wake up somewhere that you had not already seen 100 times before you arrived. To arrive uncertain. To arrive genuinely open. To let the journey ask something of you rather than managing it into something it cannot ask. What we've explored together tonight is not just the history of how people got from one place to another, it is the history of a relationship between human beings and the world, between effort and arrival, between the self that sets out and the self that returns. We have walked with the serfs who never left their villages and understood why that small world was still somehow a world. We have marched with Roman legions who built 50,000 miles of the road, by putting one foot in front of the other for several centuries. We have swayed in stagecoaches through English mud argued about windows, with Benjamin Franklin wept at the sight of land after 15 weeks on the Atlantic. We have carried medicine chests with opium and silver teapots. We have written our wills before departure. We have fallen to the ground in a Florentine church because the beauty was more than we were prepared for. We have walked to Jerusalem in the year 1413, which I want to point out is an extremely impressive thing to do by any standard. And we have watched Thomas Cook put 485 ordinary working people on a train with a brass band and a shared meal and change the world. All of this happened. All of it was real. All of these men and women walked and rode and sailed and stumbled their way across the earth before anyone could do it for them. There is a line I return to often, not from a famous philosopher or a celebrated author, but from a medieval traveller's account that has mostly been forgotten. The road is never wasted on the one who walks it. I don't know exactly who said it first. It appears in various forms across several traditions, Arabic, Latin, Persian, which suggests that it is the kind of truth that keeps being discovered by whoever is walking at any given moment. The road is never wasted on the one who walks it, not because every road leads somewhere important, but because the act of walking, the physical embodied slow, uncertain act of putting yourself in motion through the world does something to a person that cannot be replicated by arrival alone. You tonight have travelled, not far by the standards of the people we've been spending time with, not across the Gobi Desert or the Atlantic or the Alps in a dismantled carriage, but you've moved through 12 centuries of human movement in a few hours, and maybe some small part of the world we've been describing together has arrived inside you as something real. The smell of salt water after 6 weeks at sea, the sound of leather soles on stone, the extraordinary improbable gift of seeing somewhere new when you had no idea what to expect, the knowledge, quiet, steady, earned that you went, that you made it, that the road gave you something the staying home never could. I want to thank you genuinely and warmly for spending this night with me, for keeping the light low and the fan on, for letting the story in, for being the kind of person who finds meaning in the long, strange, beautiful, difficult history of human beings trying to get somewhere. You are part of that history. Every journey you've ever taken, every road, every sea crossing, every airport departure lounge at 5 a.m. When you were running on no sleep and terrible coffee, all of it connects back to something older and stranger than you probably knew. You're the inheritor of the stagecoach, and the pilgrim route, and the Roman road, and the Silk Road, and the medieval inn where Benjamin Franklin and John Adams once argued about a window while lying in the same bed in a small town in New Jersey. That lineage belongs to you, and tonight for a few hours we travelled it together. So, before you sleep tonight, before this long road of story settles quietly into the soft dark where it belongs, let me leave you with one small invitation. Think of a journey you've been meaning to take, not the big one, not the dream destination you have saved and planned and over-researched, just a small one, a road you haven't driven, a town nearby that you have never actually stopped in, a walk you keep meaning to take but keep postponing, because there is always something more urgent. Plan to go, and when you go slowly enough to notice. The road is never wasted on the one who walks it. Sleep well. You have travelled far tonight, and if these stories reached you in the quiet way they were meant to, if something in the history of human wandering touched something in your own, then I hope you'll come back for the next journey. There are so many more. The world is very old and very strange and full of roads we've not yet walked together. Rest now. The next adventure can wait until morning.